So nice to come and talk today. The topic I've chosen is to talk about type 1 diabetes specifically, and some of our work and other work on technology, and specifically this crossover now between glucose monitoring and also insulin delivery. And we've got a really nice collaboration that we've built, across the DSM, through the university and to other centres. It's an area we're really passionate about, and I think at the moment, while we await a cure, which has sort of been promised every 10 years since certainly I've been doing diabetes, but I think since about 1920 that's been promised. So I think in the meantime, technology is definitely what is going to improve people's lives with diabetes, and it's going to step into that void while we await a more definitive answer. So I'll talk a little bit about type 1, a little bit about history, and then talk about why we think glucose monitoring is so important and why that links then in to how we move into insulin delivery. And then we'll talk about our studies that we're doing now and that we have planned, but also a little touch on where things might be heading in the future. And clearly, again, this is the area where things will really improve for people with type 1 diabetes. So just to remind you what type 1 diabetes is, these are two different children just around the time that insulin was discovered. They were both undergoing starvation therapy in an institution, which was the only way you could keep children alive for a short period of time when they developed type 1 diabetes. And of course, they went on very low calorie diets. They wasted away. You could keep them from much sooner death from acidosis and diabetic ketoacidosis by doing this, but this is how they appeared. And then just setting that scene and then giving you a bit of a link to some of the people who were instrumental in changing that for those children. So first gentleman is from Austria, Oskar Mankowski, and him and others worked in Strasbourg, and they were working with dogs, and so that he in fact did all the surgical operations where they removed the pancreases of these dogs and discovered the link between removing the pancreas and the dogs developing diabetes. And they weren't able to take it any further, but others built on their work. Nicolae Polescu, he was Romanian. He was working in this area just before and just at the very beginning of World War I. And he almost discovered insulin. So there's a movement occasionally to recognize him for maybe discovering insulin. He certainly did document improvements in the dogs that he had removed the pancreases of, and then he would stew the pancreases up and give that extract back to them. And there were some small improvements in glucose levels that he documented in his early papers. But then he was interrupted by the war, and he never was able to realise the work that he had come very close to doing. He was also had some very terrible sort of political and social views, which probably made him less popular for giving Nobel Prizes to and things as well. Frederick Allen, the extremely severe guy in the bottom, as you might imagine looking at his face, he was the father of the starvation diet. And certainly until the discovery of insulin, his method was the only way to keep anybody alive who developed type 1, but only for a short period of time. And then this is Frederick Banting. Oh, there we go, Frederick Banting and Best, and one of their dogs. Their work was how we discovered insulin. I guess the dog is there. They also were using dogs for their research, so they would remove the pancreas of the dogs, but prior to that they would ligate all the pancreatic ducts, and that was how they jumped forward from everyone else. So they got rid of all the exocrine aspects of the pancreas through sort of auto-digestion before they took that next step, and then they would stew up the pancreases after that, and they would end up with this insulin-like extract. It was, and so that was their work. It wasn't a good time to be a dog in Toronto, so they were buying dogs off the street, and it's certainly rumoured that people's pets went missing over that time as well. So here's the four of them. This was the team that discovered it. So in fact, the top two gentlemen, John McLeod and Frederick Banting, they both received jointly the Nobel Prize in Medicine. for that discovery. And they then both shared it. So Banting shared his portion of that and with Best, and James McLeod shared it with Collip, who was the biochemist who was able to purify it enough so that it would actually work. So the first child they gave it to who was in a coma, developed terrible anaphylaxis and reactions to what they gave it, and then Collip was rushed in from the States. He was able to purify it enough to then a week later try again, and that was successful. They're also interesting because here's the only photo with more than 2 of them in the same location. So Collip's not present here. This is Banting over here. But really they were extremely dysfunctional and they didn't talk to each other at all. And in fact, shortly after the discovery, McLeod was so upset he went back to Scotland. They carried on, but this is the only photo with 3 of them in the room, and there's no photo with 4 of them together, which is fairly interesting in itself. But then what they did discover is they discovered insulin. It rapidly went into production. And Eli Lilly, who were involved right at an early point, are still one of the main insulin producing companies today. And this is what it does. So it converts this near death through to still a slightly unhappy couple of children, but certainly a lot healthier than they were before. And then Leonard Thompson, he was the boy who was in the coma at the start of the story. He got the first extracts. He somehow managed to survive for a week while they purified some more. But it was thanks, I guess, in part to him that we then realised we hadn't solved the diabetes problem. So there was a lot of celebration here. Diabetes was cured. Everything was fine. And you can see here, even in this photo, probably relatively shortly before his death, he's using a cane. And so at the age of 25, he died from complications of his diabetes. So just again, emphasising how important good glycemic control has turned out to be in restoring the longevity to these people who are affected by diabetes. And so I guess with Leonard came a big push to how we could improve things further. And I guess this is where glucose monitoring came in. It was always present, fortunately before my time. This is maybe how you train, Barry. But here's a urine flavour. That's right. So here's a urine flavour wheel, and this is how you could, so of course, importantly, he's demonstrating it wasn't just the taste that was important, but also the colour and the texture and the smell, and he's demonstrating examining the urine, but I'm sure he's going to dip into that soon as well. So from here, it actually took quite a while. So urine was the key method until actually the 1960s, 1970s, even the early 1980s, depending on where you were. But first ability to measure a blood glucose wasn't until the early 1800s. And the urine techniques were all qualitative, and they sort of expanded over the 19th century. And really, you can see an example here of one of the methods used at the end of World War II, where basically it was all by colour. So it's all qualitative. You would mix it up, you'd heat it with a Bunsen burner, you'd get it warm enough, you'd keep it in that condition for a period of time, and then you'd read the colour 5 or 10 minutes later. We had a really interesting talk by Jan Parker, who is the Chief Operating Officer in the lab currently. She's been working there for 50 years, but she described how in the 60s they were able to do 2 or 3 blood glucose levels a day. Each one took 2 hours to brew up before you'd get the value. So she said her days were quiet when no one wanted a blood glucose measurement. So we moved on from here, and then in the mid-1960s, the first machine that could measure blood glucose came. Took a minute to test. You still had to wash away. It was still calorimetric, so you still had to compare to colour. And it was very expensive. It weighed over 1 kilo and was only used in laboratories. And clearly when Jan was talking, she was talking about 1966, so certainly Dunedin did not have even these machines until the end of the 60s probably. But clearly now it's moved a long way. They're small. This is the current funded, I'll put a point over here, current funded meter from Pharmac. They take only a very small amount of blood, extremely fast, so you get a result within 2 to 5 seconds. They're relatively cheap, still cost many millions of dollars in testing strips for the New Zealand government every year. But now we're also moving into continuous glucose monitoring, which measures interstitial glucose, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Flash glucose monitoring, which is another technology using that same technology. And then also how we integrate that with insulin delivery to create what we'd call an artificial pancreas or a closed loop, and that's definitely where things are heading. And I guess the reason I'm emphasizing this is blood glucose measurement is so crucial. It's really the basis of everything we do. Well, I guess not only blood glucose, but any form of glucose measurement, as you'll see for the future. But it's also how we manage all safety, and it's also all glycemic control is dependent on glucose monitoring. So these are nice data. Again, it's a surrogate, I guess, of adherence to therapy. But you can see here, there's a huge German, Austrian database, 26,000 children over 10 years. You can see there every additional glucose level they do to about a peak of 6 will improve their HbA1cs by 0.5% or 5 millimoles per mole. So the more people interact with their diabetes, the healthier they will be. Here's a similar data from America, just showing exactly the same thing. The more you test, doesn't matter whether you're on a pump, whether you're injecting, whatever you're doing, if you test lots, your HbA1c falls by about 0.5% every single time you test. This is the same sort of data again, but looking at giving meal boluses with insulin. And again, I guess the glucose behavior mimics what your bolusing behavior will be. But if you miss 4 meal doses a week, your HbA1c goes up by 1% or about 10 millimoles per mole. So what we really want is to find ways to motivate people to be adherent with the treatments we're prescribing for them. And I guess one of the issues is how accurate is this? And so the first paper on, here's a nice example from a couple of my patients, just showing here, you can see the top one, this is a logbook. Don't have too many of these anymore, but this sort of perfect glucose, pretty perfect, all in target, the occasional one drifting above into double digits, but mostly sort of between 4 and 8. But their HbA1c was 110, so clearly there's no way that logbook, the numbers in that logbook are reflecting what the actual glucose status of that patient is. And here's another one, this is someone on a pump, heaps of data in here, all beautifully green and target, HbA1c 100. There's just no way that data that's going into that pump or into that logbook is the data that the patient is actually experiencing. And so this was seen in early 1980s. This is the very first glucose meters that were going out to patients for their own home monitoring. And none of them were aware that they had a memory function in them. They just thought they were just at the time you tested, that's the value you got. But of course they did have a memory. And so these guys here were the first to look back in that memory. And so they showed that about 75% of all the participants in their study modified their data. And they coined this interesting term called the phantom. And I see lots of phantoms in my clinic, but they're where there's a glucose level in the pump or in the logbook, but there's no actual glucose level ever being recorded. And it's sort of a cool name. And I guess it just reflects the significant burden that these people are going through, and also their desire to be successful or to have people get off their backs, a whole range of motivations for this. But again, it goes in both directions. People obscure hypo and they obscure hyperglycemia, so both equally important. And they also, in this early paper, showed it didn't matter how good the control of the diabetes was. People with really healthy control were just as likely to create phantoms and fabricate data as people with very unhealthy control. So possibly for slightly different reasons, but they're equally likely to do the same thing. And we've been quite interested in sort of the early, some of our early work in diabetes was in this exact area, and we've published a reasonable amount on this, including the only review in the area. But again, our findings in modern patients are exactly the same as that 1980s data, that people, for various reasons, don't accurately document their blood glucose levels. And I guess the question is there a better way? And I think technology is the way. We just remove that aspect of things from them, and continuous glucose monitoring is where things are heading. So this gives interstitial glucose, so it's inserted into the fat through the skin. It measures continuously or normally every minute, and this is continuously updated, and normally some sort of algorithm will summarize that data for you every 15 minutes or so. Uses exactly the same glucose oxidase-based reaction that all the finger prick glucose meters use as well. And it's all hidden here in the electrode here. So here's a nice picture of it. So this is the electrode here. It's normally made of gold, and it sends signals to a transmitter that's worn externally on the body. But what you do is you encase that in a whole lot of peroxide and then a range of other stuff to protect the electrode so the body doesn't reject it or get rid of it too quickly. But then when glucose penetrates this membrane here, it reacts with the peroxide. This peroxide is then converted into an electrical charge. That electrical charge is picked up by the electrode here, transmits up, and then we get a glucose value that corresponds with the amount of electrical charge you're making from the amount of peroxide you've made. And so the secret of continuously monitoring is you just have to be able to protect that electrode for long enough that when it's implanted, it's still useful over time. And at the moment, we can normally get up to about 2 weeks. Some people can even push these sensors out to 3 weeks or even 4 weeks, depending on how quickly their bodies will reject them. But certainly the companies would recommend only a week at a time. So the older models require 2 or 3 calibrations a day. There's no models of continuous glucose monitoring in New Zealand that don't require calibration, but there is a new device down here, the G6, the Dexcom G6, which requires no calibration. And there's also this thing called the Libre or flash glucose monitoring, and I'll talk about that now. Oh no, here's just, this is just showing you how powerful this technology is. So these are traces of patients from my clinic, but again, just showing, so the green areas, 4 to 10, and just showing how you get these sort of rises and falls in glucose levels continuously every minute throughout the day. And then we can adjust all our treatments based on these values. Of course, it creates a fairly extensive burden on time for our clinic. So in the old days where they just had a logbook and there were a few glucose levels in it and you had 2 different types of insulin you could prescribe, it was all pretty straightforward. You could power through the patients. You just can't now. I'm constantly being emailed by people and ask people to look through this data. So there's certainly other challenges that comes with the amount of information that we're now getting, but certainly we think it's improving the lives of the people who are using it. And here's this young woman here, I've grabbed off the internet, but she's wearing the G6. This is, I tried to find a child. She was pretty much the only one I could find wearing one. But the main thing showing, that's what it looks like, that's how big it is. And the G5 and the G4 are in New Zealand, they're exactly the same size. But what's cool about this model, other than it can go onto your smartwatch, so you get a continuous trace whenever you look at your watch while you're sitting in my talk. It can go onto your phone. That's the insertion device. You just sort of plug that onto your skin and push the button and whoosh, it's in. But it's also amazingly accurate. So this has a mean absolute relative difference. So this is comparing to a gold standard. And in this study, that's to a factory calibrated glucose lab-based technology. But its accuracy is 7.7%. So it deviates from the gold standard by plus or minus 7.7, which is sort of the gold standard of any sort of glucose monitoring. The common meters that we use have an accuracy of about 10%. And so this device looks pretty amazing, really. It's factory calibrated. There's no blood glucose levels required. You can make all your treatment decisions based on this device. No calibrations. Most people using one of these would test once or twice a week, maybe. And you can wear this for 10 days before it conks out. Of course, it probably costs, it's only available in the States at the moment. It'll be here in the next 6 months, but it's going to cost, I guess, about $8,000 to $10,000 a year to run that. Then we've got flash glucose monitoring. This has been a big boom area at the moment. Earlier last year, it received approval for use in children in New Zealand, but it had approval for use in the UK a few years before that. But I guess this has been a sort of a revolutionary technology. All of this glucose monitoring technology I'm showing you is the next revolution. I think there's no doubt that we'll look back on blood glucose in the same way we sort of amusingly look back on urine. There's no doubt about that. So this is flash glucose monitoring. You wear the same sort of sensor, but instead of being continuously delivered, it's only available to you when you swipe. You can swipe your phone or you can swipe your device over it and get your glucose values. And again, you get the same sort of trace. There's there that we can adjust glucose levels by. But certainly this is the first cheap and readily available technology that requires no blood glucose levels. So most people using this are only testing a handful of times a week. But it has a few downsides, has a small lag depending on the participant. Some people will lag 4 or 5 minutes, some will lag only a minute from their blood glucose. So whatever you're getting on your screen may not reflect what the glucose is doing at that moment. Some people, if you're at the worst end of the spectrum, take about 20 minutes to equilibrize between their blood and their interstitial fluid. And it's pretty accurate. 11.4% is the mean absolute relative difference between that and the gold standard. And again, you have these Clark error grids. That's how you measure all this stuff. But basically, you can see the sensor glucose and the capillary reader reference range here. They're very much clustered together down the center there, so very closely correlated. And again, in this sort of seminal paper on how accurate and successful this was, the mean lag time was about 4.5 minutes. It's also a little bit less accurate on the first day of wear, and that's what we often find. There's something about the immune reaction when you put a sensor in, it doesn't work quite as well. Is it the same accurate? No, none of the sensors appear to be. So when you're very low, good question, when you're low, they tend to be less accurate. So it'll often read low when you're actually normal. So we do recommend to our patients when they're low, they do test at the moment with these devices to avoid over-treating. The main worry we get is then they sort of roller coaster through the day, they over-treat, they end up out of target. Much harder to fix a high blood glucose than it is to fix a low blood glucose. And the same at the extremes. And in fact, some of the companies, the Dexcom data I showed earlier, they've been fairly honest. They included data up to the maximum of the device they were using to reference it against, which was into the 30s. But some of the devices, to get their accuracy, they only report within a narrow range. So they remove all blood glucose values above 30, say. They remove all blood glucose levels below 2. And then they give a reported accuracy for that range. But of course, when you're outside of that range, they may be far more inaccurate than they report. In fact, some of them as much as 20% inaccurate. When they're in target, they report to 10, but then they go out to about 20%. So there's quite a range. But again, this is sort of really summarizing that data I showed, those big databases. This is 60 million tests using this device published by the company. But you can just see again, this is estimated HbA1c based on the CGM trace. And as you swipe more, you're getting fairly obsessive when you're swiping 30, 40 or 50 times a day. We may be creating some other issues with this technology, but there's certainly no doubt that if you use it a lot, you're extremely adherent and your diabetes is extremely healthy. This is number of scans per day and hours above 10. So again, the time you spend out of target dramatically reduces the more you scan. And basically all of these traces say something fairly similar to that. You spend less time hypo, less time hyper, more time in range, and your HbA1c is much healthier. And again, the reality is HbA1c is slowly dying. It's a technology that we're all used to and we're used to reporting to work out the risk to our patients going forward of complications. But there's no doubt now in our group, we're arguing more and more, is HbA1c our primary outcome anymore in the studies? And certainly one of the studies we're doing, there's quite a lot of argument that it should be all continuous glucose monitoring traces. They're much more reflective of what we're interested in, what's happening to the glucose levels through the day than a measure of glycation on hemoglobin every 3 months. And we've become quite interested in teenagers. This just emphasizes what happens in teenage years. So this is age along the bottom here. You you can see here there's this very stable phase from around 30, 25 to 30, where HbA1c comes very close to the sort of ranges we would like. In our clinic, we'd say we want people under 55. So that's sort of down here. So we want people at 7% in the old terms. We want them as below that as we can safely get them. You can see here, firstly, not many people achieve that. And greater than 75% of the youth in this data here, so this is 20,000 American children and children in that part, and then all their adult data out here, so there's even more than 20,000 in there. But greater than 75% of the youth don't come even close to meeting targets. And what you can see here is when you become a teenager, you have this massive spike in your HbA1c, and then it all just settles out again once their frontal lobes develop a bit more. And so we're very interested in that group. They're pretty much exclusively ignored from every trial and every drug company trial. They're quite a challenging group to do research on. But we're really interested with those people who are struggling, would they benefit from some of this technology, particularly the flash glucose monitoring technology with no calibrations, where it's an easy insertion, you can get more glucose data, you're clearly reducing their burden. So are they a group that might benefit from some of this technology? And we've got a study currently running on that. And so we're recruiting people who are aged 13 to 20 inclusive. I think when I wrote this slide, we were at 55 out of 64. I think Sarah's telling me we're 58 and 2 more being screened this week. So we're thinking in the next week or 2 we'll finish enrollment in that trial. But basically it's 2 phases. There's an RCT phase for 6 months where half of the participants get the device and half of them don't. And then there's another 6-month phase where everybody gets the device in the continuation phase. So we're very excited by that. It's funded by Cure Kids, APEG, NZSSD, and the Dunedin School of Medicine. So we've had really generous funding to run that, and it's completely independent of the company. So again, a lot of the money we're spending on the trial is in the sensors themselves. There's our funders there. And I guess what we're also becoming more interested in, hopefully next time we talk I can give you some data on that, but I'm quite interested in these what we call sort of open source or open access hacks or add-ons that you can put onto some of these devices. So the FreeStyle Libre that I showed you with our trials running on, that's about $2,500 a year to run. So it's about a half to a third less expensive than the continuous glucose monitoring technology. But with one of these devices here, so this device here, the BlueCon, or this one here, which has got this great name called the Meow Meow, you can put one of those on. You can imagine the Meow Meow is purchased from China somewhere. There's not been a single study done on either of these devices. But basically that converts the signal from your FreeStyle Libre into a continuous source of Bluetoothable material. And so it tricks the sensor into thinking it's being swiped all the time. And then you can transmit it on to your smartwatch or to your phone, and you can put alarms on it, and you can get all the benefits theoretically of much more expensive technology for, this is $300 and it lasts until the sort of time that Chinese electronics last. And this is similar, this is waterproof. We think that might be quite good on kids. This one here is not waterproof, but again, no one knows if they're any good. But the anecdotal stuff is that they can be very good, and they can also be a real pain in the butt sometimes as well. And so we've got some funding applications in for a RCT on this soon too, hopefully. What's also just come out in the last few months is implantable CTMS technology. So this is how you do it. You make a wee incision, it's a bit like putting in a long-acting reversible contraception. You make a wee incision, you have this big introducer device, you stick that in, you implant your sensor, and then you put a couple of steri strips on it, and then they go off on their way. So this is called the Eversense. This is the FDA sort of media release here from, what's the date, June 25th. So that's just come out in the States with FDA approval. That's how big the sensor is. That's a 1 cent coin in America. So it's just about 2 centimeters long. It lasts for 3 months in about 80 or 90% of the people that you put it in. Surgically inserted, and again they've cut off the extremes, but if you put that aside, it's got a MARD of 8.8%, so very accurate. So plus or minus 8.8% on what the gold standard glucose measurement would be, although they determine what the gold standard would be. So with all this data, you've got to be a little nervous because sometimes it's not what we would consider a gold standard. But basically that gets implanted, and then you wear this removable sensor over top of it, and you just strap that on, and whenever you want, you can pull it off. But the device vibrates and does a range of other things, even when you're not looking at your glucose levels. So it'll tell you if you go low, it'll tell you if you go out of target. It looks very interesting. At the moment, I wouldn't be standing in line to be one of the first people to wear one of these. There's one of the 100 or so people in the first trial had to have a GA to get it out again when it came out. But certainly this is where things are heading. So this is, I don't think you want to be an early adopter with any of this stuff, but this is the first go, and it's going to get heaps better. So that's what it looks like. And again, that's it transmitting to your smartphone or to your smartwatch. And I guess just that's a bit like this. This is 1960. This is an insulin pump. And I guess why I'm interested in those is because the whole purpose of doing all this glucose monitoring is if we can hook those to pumps, then we've created an artificial pancreas. If we can get it all communicating, we can remove some of the human error side of it, then we'll both dramatically reduce the burden to these people, but we'll also definitely improve their health. So this is what an original pump, this is 1963, this photo gets thrown around a lot at all these sort of talks, but this has also got glucagon in it, so maybe it's meant to be half the size if you just had insulin in it. But he's got a couple of sort of fairly full-on cannulas going on there. I'd have trouble selling that to our teens in clinic. But now this is the most funded version now in our clinics. Pharmac's very generously been funding these since 2012, giving us sort of world-leading access to pumps, although they are not the world-leading pumps. So, so we watch the space for that. But basically, they provide continuous insulin, and it's rapid-acting insulin. So it's either Aspart or Lispro, so Novorapid or Humalog, and that's constantly infused, getting rid of the need for other types of insulin. So there's no more basal insulin, this insulin that's there to provide background cover for all the glucose your body makes, and you infuse rapid-acting insulin instead. And then every time you ingest carbohydrate, and I guess if you're German, they also count protein as well. We generally stick to counting carbs, but the Germans love counting protein as well. They do both. But if you count the carbs, and then you can give yourself bolus insulin to manage your glucose fluctuations. And all of this uses a computer. You have settings pre-programmed in it, and it's also a burden reducer. So in all the studies done on these, everybody's quality of life improves in those studies. Normally, in every study that has been measured, quality of life's improved. The actual HbA1c reductions are possibly not as impressive as you would hope. So they improve things by around 0.2 to 0.5% in the big meta-analyses. There's plenty of studies around where there was an improvement of 1% or things like that. It also depends on what group you do your study on. It also depends on how long it is, because people fatigue. If you measure a study with an outcome of only 3 months, primary outcome, then everybody improves by about 1% when you put a device like this on them. But if you really want to know what's going to happen in the real world, you've got to follow them for at least a year to really understand what's going on. And they also reduce severe hypoglycemia. So that's one of the main criteria for Pharmac for us to get people onto pumps. And really all the data in the past was a bit inconclusive on that, but all the recent data is very supportive on its role in preventing hypoglycemia. And hypoglycemia is certainly the biggest fear that families have about their diabetes. And this is what pumps look like now. So these are the new generation of pumps. So the model that Pharmac's funded now, they were new in about 2008. And I guess we're definitely ready for an upgrade. And Pharmac's currently considering this now. And I think we're expecting a decision any time in October, maybe into November. And I would anticipate, I'm hoping they'll fund both of these. This is the replacement to the outgoing model where more than 95% of our patients are using. And this here is the pump that this company here by Medtronic is the main pump company in the world. They have about 95% of the world market. They have about 1% of the New Zealand market, but that's certainly coming. And this is just an idea of, this is their pump here this is what the infusion set looks like. And then there's a wee cannula or a wee needle in the body here. You would insert this in every 3 days or so. But then this is communicating with this glucose sensor. So this is a continuous glucose monitor, and it communicates to the pump. And in this case, in terms of this pump that we hope Pharmac will fund, it does a few other clever tricks using that data. You can see they're very much in line with sort of the modern devices that people are used to using now. In fact, this was modeled off an iPhone. This is a bit of our data, unpublished, but just showing what's happened since you fund insulin pumps. So this is the proportion of users, so up to 0.15 in this one. This is by year, and this is gender, this one. So you can see, for whatever reason, females are more likely to get access to this than males. But the ones that really interest me is this one here and this one here. This is New Zealand Europeans. So if you're New Zealand European, you dramatically have improved access to this, even though we use the same criteria and the same public funding for all. So this is Pacific down the bottom here, and this is Māori. And then this is the same for economic deprivation. So this is the least deprived and the most deprived. So even when you publicly fund these things, it's not the end of the story. There's other stuff going on that limits quite large percentages of the population from accessing this stuff. This is age, not a surprise. If you're young, up to about 30% of youth are now using pumps. And in my clinic, it's about 50%. And if you're over 70, not quite as much use here. But I've certainly given a talk recently where someone who was over 80 came up to me at the end and showed me his pump and said he'd just had it for a few years and was enjoying it, but it had some problems. And that's the main thing. There are some problems. The infusion sites fail, the body rejects them, things get kinked, they leak sometimes, the technology fails every now and then. They're surprisingly reliable, and despite all of that, people say they don't want to give them back. But we've been quite interested in this, and again, published quite a bit on adverse events. So I guess the real thing here is all of this. This is insulin being discovered in the 1920s, coming through, and this is glucose monitoring technology improving. But you can just see as all of that's happened, it's all coming to this pointy end where we're starting to get close to the sort of the holy grail. This is the artificial pancreas, or what we call the closing the loop. So we close the loop between what the participant has to do. You're connecting the glucose monitoring to the pump, making a complete cycle that removes the patient from what's going on inside there. And that's really what people want. This is some of the early data. So it's published in one of the main diabetes journals, Diabetes Care. This is last year. This is using the technology that Pharmac will be funding. Although Pharmac they'll fund the device that can do it, but they won't fund the sensors. So then you'll still have to buy a sensor worth $5,000 a year to run it. But here's the sensor. Here's the device. And basically what this does is, in this version of the technology, it looks out into the future, has an algorithm, it's constantly assessing the glucose data. And when you're 30 minutes out from going low, it turns itself off. So this is at 3.3 here, predicts you're going to go low, it turns itself off, and then ideally it then starts to rise again, turns the pump back on, and then it carries on. So the aim of this is to remove the really major fear that people have that they're going to have hypoglycemia while they're sleeping. That's the main fear they have. Their children are going to die, and children do die. So there's a condition called dead in bed, where the child's found dead in the morning. No one knows what's happened. It's thought to be hypoglycemia, perhaps connected to an arrhythmia that the hypoglycemia may or may not precipitate. It's very rare, but it's what everyone's worried about. And I guess this will also work while you're doing sport. So it'll turn the pump off while you're doing your sport, turn it back on again when you're coming right. And so this is the data on that. So basically it halves the amount of hypoglycemia you have. It's not perfect, but it halves what you're seeing. And again, the only interesting thing with this technology, this is the Medtronic device that will be likely funded here, is actually the time above target. So the time above 8 actually deteriorates slightly. So whenever the pump's being turned off, it's not quite coming on and quick enough to stop you going to rising afterwards. So again, we need to perfect that a bit. Their competitor has just published their data, which shows no rise in time above target. So there's quite a fierce sort of rivalry and battle going on with some of that. But all of this is moving. The next step, and that's currently available in the States, but not yet funded here, is what we call hybrid closed loop. So it runs in closed loop quite a large amount of the time, but you still have to signal to it and tell it how much carbohydrate you're eating. And also in the current technology, tell it what your blood glucose level is. So it won't take the glucose level it's sensing to do your food boluses. You have to tell it that yourself. You have to manually do that. And you still have to calibrate that system. So that if you buy that system in the States now for $12,000 tomorrow, you still have to run your sensor for $5,000 a year. You still have to calibrate that with finger pricks a minimum of 2 times a day. The more you calibrate it, the more accurate it becomes. But this is the sort of data you get. This is insulin delivery. It's blipping along here. Glucose levels risen a little bit here. Oh, sorry, that's the plasma insulin delivery rate. So it's plasma insulin and the infusion rate. And this is paired with glucose levels here. So glucose levels a bit higher, giving much more insulin here. But then when it senses you're going low, turns everything off. So the delivery goes right down, plasma insulin drops, and then it starts to rise again. The insulin will then kick off again. So it does that, and you end up with these beautiful loops, a bit like this. If you look at someone's glucose using one of these systems, it clamps you at 6.8. You just run all night long like that, no matter what's been going on. Just turns you on and off to keep you in there. So that people in the studies on this sort of device, they just don't want to give them back. They just love them, even though you have to calibrate. And so this is called the 670G hybrid loop closed loop. It's been around since 2016. Has no basal rates at all. It uses its own calculations to determine how much insulin you need when you're fasting or sleeping. But you signal to it your carbohydrate and the glucose data. It's not registered for use in people under 7, and their argument is that the algorithms get less accurate if you're on much lower doses of insulin. I think they're also, worried. Well, the biggest fear of all the companies with this technology is that something bad happens with it that then causes a big step back from this technology for people, and no one wants that. And this uses their latest sensor, which looks really good. And it's the only sensor currently approved to use with hybrid closed loop. So that's how it works. And this is what it does. This is a Bionic Pancreas. So one of the groups calls theirs the Bionic Pancreas, which is pretty cool. This is published in the Lancet just last year. But again, this is on Bionic Pancreas. So just make sure I get this right. Oh yeah, so this is Bionic Pancreas here. So just tightens everything up. You spend less time low, less time high, much more time in target. So under 10, almost 90% of the time was spent in target on this device, where if you look at traditional, they're using continuous glucose monitoring and a pump, so they're still pretty high-tech stuff, more high-tech than what Pharmac funds, but they spend about 60% of the time in target. So that's what we're looking at. The Bionic Pancreas is dual hormone that uses both glucagon and insulin, so they wear 2 pumps. And there's a range of issues with that. I think personally we're unlikely to go forward with that too much more, but they're still going for that at the moment. And I guess why we're interested in this is where we've got a world first study coming here December, January in collaboration with Christchurch, quite significant funding. And so this is super exciting. No one else in the world will have used this technology. And so it's the next iteration of that technology from the one I just showed you. So 670G is what's available in America, and this is their new algorithm, and it's thought to be even more exciting. And we're hoping to prove it doesn't need calibration. And so that'll be run from here, 20 participants here in Dunedin and 20 participants in Christchurch. And they'll be aged 14 to 70. They have to be using a pump. And so if anyone in the audience is wearing a pump and wants to try the latest, they're welcome to come and talk to me afterwards. But so they're established pumpers. We're very excited about this. It's going to mean that South Island families get to try out the latest stuff before it goes anywhere else. And I guess we're hoping the study will go well and that more of those studies will then run here as well. And so again, looking here, not a single mention of HbA1c as a primary outcome. It's all about time spent in range, time spent hyperglycemic, and then a bunch of other secondary outcomes. So HbA1c, again, is quietly dying. It's eventually going to be replaced with all this stuff. And we've also very interested in this device, and again with Martin de Bock, who is the primary investigator for that previous study. We've got an HRC application that's into the second round for this, and this is taking advantage of this thing called the open APS. And so basically, these are a whole bunch of really clever people affected by diabetes who have been really distressed at how slow it's been for the companies to close the loop, basically. It's taken a long, long time. You know, saw that pump in 1963. Well, now we're 50 years later. We're just starting to close the loop now. So certainly they've become upset. And so a number of people have invented their own closed loop algorithms. And so traditionally, they have what this guy here has got. There's quite a few thousand people using this around the world now. And he builds his own device, and then he hacks into an old-fashioned insulin pump. He hacks into the continuous glucose monitor, and then he brings it all together, and he runs his own closed loop with an algorithm that he's devised or he's downloaded off the internet. And they say there's thousands of people, but it's an N equals 1 because you have to make your own system. You can't buy one. You can't do anything else. But this is his night. You can just see again how beautiful his glucose levels are through the night using that device. And I guess what's even more exciting though is with this pump here, they've got about a 0.1% share of the world's pump market, maybe less. But they've made their pump, they've seen this niche, and they've made their pump so you don't have to hack it anymore. They just let you into it. So you can go inside this, you can hook up your Dexcom G6 sensor here to it. You can run your algorithm in the pump, all goes through your phone, and it does exactly what that other technology does, but it does it for extremely cheap price compared to the company technology. Again, none of it is fully integrated, none of it's made by the same person. There's no research on it other than from the people who are doing it, but people who are doing it love it and are extremely passionate, and they've got this hashtag on Twitter called "We Are Not Waiting." And so that device is there, and so we've got a funding grant in at the moment to try and fund a fairly large study running that. And so I guess, again, just sort of as I close up, just highlighting that things have moved from here, and I guess we laugh at this a little bit. We've moved to here, but I think we'll be doing the same thing here. I'll be giving this talk in 30 years, and I'll be telling you how we used to torture our children by doing all these finger pricks on them, and laugh at that. I'll think, man, why did we do all that crazy stuff? Because we'll be moving into all this extra, who knows what it is, but here's a sort of a Star Trek body scanner here. And I'm sure we'll be able to do glucose by that perhaps soon. And so just to thank all the people who have been involved in those studies and our funders at the bottom of the currently running studies, but I haven't thanked the funders of future studies, and happy to take any questions. Larry, do you want the cube? I've been told I'm meant to use the cube. Am I? No? Right. So in terms of the sensors, if you leave something indwelling in the body, it's a bit like an IV cannula. It'll reject it in the sense that it'll bung up your sensor eventually. And so, and the same with the insulin infusion devices, because they're little Teflon or little steel cannulas that are very small for the infusions, it's safe to say that you should change that every 3 days, but like an IV, exactly like an IV cannula, it should be changed every 3 days. Otherwise, the body bungs it up. Because you're using rapid-acting insulin the whole time, if you have any period of time where that flow of rapid-acting insulin is interrupted, you get sick fast. So they get DKA very quickly if they have any interruption in that flow. So that's why it's important. The sensors themselves, the way they're protecting them, that we're getting out to a couple of weeks of protection from the body and those sensors, and there doesn't appear to be a big drop off in their accuracy over time. Going out beyond a few weeks, who knows? So there are people who sort of hack their sensors and run them out even longer. There's people who you can send them to over, in the States or even in parts of New Zealand who'll hack them and change the batteries and do all sorts of cool stuff to them. Again, no one quite knows what any of that's doing. In terms of, because they're stuck on you with a strong adhesive, certainly there is a group of people who have quite nasty skin reactions from them. We've seen the odd infection. Considering how many people we've got on pumps, I've had one kid with a wee abscess in his butt that I had to drain in clinic one day. But other than that, we've not seen major infections or problems. But they do get skin things, and it's a known complication of the gear. So as soon as we find a way to bypass strong adhesives, I guess that's why the implantable sensors, some people are very excited about those because it gets around all the adhesive and I guess more visibly, obvious, some of the stuff is, yeah. Hi. Oh. Mm.
So, Michael, one of the concerns we've had with medical devices and pharmacovigilance is that they haven't had the clinical testing that medicines get. So I was just wondering if you knew for the recent, the Eversense device approved by the FDA, do you know what size clinical trials, I hope were done, but have you any idea? Of the
to get FDA approval, they're sort of 100 or 200 participants. Yeah, they're not thousands of participants.
There's actually been a really interesting documentary on Netflix called Bleeding Edge. I don't know if anyone's seen it, about medical devices, and it's highlighted the fact that a lot of them have been approved by the FDA without any, with very few numbers in studies, or sometimes with no studies at all. So you might just be interested in having
certainly the 670G, this is the hybrid closed loop, the FDA expedited that because there was so much unhappiness that they had been very slow. And in fact, the previous technologies everywhere in the world got access to them before the Americans because of the FDA. So there has been this expedited FDA process, which may mean they've cut some of the corners they would have previously done. But certainly, there's quite a number of trials already run on hybrid closed loop, and that's very cautious. So they begin with in-clinic supervised assessments only. So they begin in hospital, and then they run them in camp settings. So, my friend Martin, who we're working with and collaborating with in Christchurch, he's done some of those. I was involved in the predictive low glucose suspend trials at the beginning, but he's been involved in this next generation. And so they hire out a whole lot of cabins in a resort or whatever, and then he sits there in a room with all their data coming to him, and they just hang out in the place. Every day they get a food order and they get whatever food they want and as many video games as they want, and they do that. But so extremely supervised the early data, and it's those studies that give the FDA approval for that device. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, we're really excited about the studies that we'll be running. Certainly, no doubt, there are safety issues with these devices. Diabetes in general is very dangerous itself, and so the current technologies appear to be less safe than the slightly unsafe alternatives. So I think it's important not to lose sight of how unsafe their underlying illness is. And I guess some of them will, particularly that open APS movement, where they're really pushing the boundaries of things. That's how worried about their diabetes these people are. They're going to quite extraordinary means to improve their health. And certainly there's no big signals that it's any less healthy or more dangerous than anything else people have been trying or using before. And certainly in the trials, they don't want to give the stuff back. So I think we don't want to lose sight. There'll be a huge number of very upset patients if we slow this stuff down too much. Hi.
Cool. With the rapid-acting insulin and the constant, do you get the same amount of lipohypertrophy and issues like that? Or less of an issue?
Get a bit less lipohypertrophy. There's a bit of data saying you might get a little bit more lipoatrophy, which is where you get a sort of an immune reaction that eats out the fat. So I do have the odd patient around who ends up with a big hollowed out area, and that's generally very hard to manage. It's mostly, again, they don't want to stop using their device. We need to run it along the edges so that it hollows it out more evenly. But those people are relatively uncommon. They're sort of maybe 1-2% of users. The really extreme examples where you get a great big patch of eaten out fat, they're even less common, but I certainly have at least one person I can think of with that. But it shows you how much they like it. They don't want to stop. If we run the sites around the edges, you can even it out a bit. If you change sites more often, that can help. People have tried other things. No, it doesn't seem to work much. But lipohypertrophy, which is big fat, big lumps from over-injecting in the same place, it gets numb, and they'd much prefer to inject it somewhere where it doesn't hurt. That's much better on a pump. And a pump's one way of treating that. Right, Barry?
Ask about lipohypertrophy.
Thank you. And they start using, I guess,
that device there?
Yeah, something off the web. Where does liability sit in terms of endorsing this or not endorsing this, and where do ACC stand if something goes wrong, etc.?
I think it's a really good question. I think it's a little bit of uncharted territory, probably. I would be assuming that if the consumer buys this gear off their own bat, which is what's been happening with the FreeStyle Libre. So before it was available in New Zealand, the first time I ever saw it was on a patient who just walked into clinic and said, I just bought this from the UK. And that's made a lot of people quite uncomfortable, although the alternative, I think, is much worse. My job is to help relieve their suffering. If I refuse to support something that they're going to do anyway, then I think I put them in more danger than if I provide support of it. I can't necessarily strongly advocate for it. I completely understand why they would want to do it. But personally, my approach has been that if they ask about it, we will talk about it and we'll support it if they buy it to the best of our ability, but they need to be aware that they're buying something with no data on it. And things like I think it's too far back, things like the meow meow or things like that, we've been talking about it with families because they're desperate for continuous glucose monitoring, can't afford the alternatives. And so we raise it. I think it's reasonable. They're going to find out anyway. Most of them have already read things online about it. We say there's no data on it. We don't know anything about it. We say we're wanting to run a trial on it. We can put you in our trial, or you can buy it. You can give it a whirl. We'll happily help you to the best of our ability. But no, and I say there's no data on it. No one knows how good it is. But anecdotally, they're thought to be, they have their own quirks, but they're thought to be similar to what the alternatives are. I think it's a really tricky area. I think ACC likely will step in New Zealand. I think people are petrified in other jurisdictions about what you do. It's been a strong message from the Australian Diabetes Association that doctors have to support people in these decisions. There's been a large group of endocrinologists who have refused to treat people who have gone and bought this stuff. And I personally think that's more unethical than supporting them in their decisions. But they need to know where the gaps in the evidence are.
Accept that, but I think it might be worth thinking about what, it's like when somebody discharges themselves against medical advice. And this is not against medical advice, but it's not actually with a good evidence base to support it. So is it worth getting a information sheet and a consent, and is the DHB lawyer worth looking at it just to cover off the fact that, we're
not selling them in clinic. I have nothing, I've got no connection to those devices, so I'm not They just buy them on the internet.
Yeah, I accept that, but the issue is, say somebody dies in the middle of the night, and the family, so they were using this device and they were getting support from the DHB. Where will the DHB stand when the parents or the family can say that this is malpractice?
I think it's uncharted territory, isn't it? I mean, it's probably going to happen at some point because people are dying from their hypoglycemia right now. I guess at the moment we just claim we've had nothing to do with it, and you know, it's sad that we offer.
You said that you'll raise the VML device
Yeah.
in the clinic, and therefore verbally supporting them. I'm just thinking.
Yeah. No, I think the problem they've got is if we withdraw the support, then I think
I
they're
don't think you
more
can ever
dangerous.
withdraw, but it's the actual actively suggesting this might be an option they can think about.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting area. I don't know what the answer is. We could have a chat. Again, the ADA has come out strongly in support of supporting people. I guess you're right. We have to be quite careful about how actively we promote some of this. I think as long as as long as they're aware of the risks and the potential benefits, then if people are going to partner with us to manage their healthcare, they have to take some responsibility for some of the actions they're taking. In my view, I guess ideally we have a full partnership where they know what the risks and the benefits are, and if they want to move ahead,
All I can say is that
it makes you nervous.
if you don't have a consent form signed by them, then it should be very carefully recorded in the.
I guess if we're not supplying it, what am I consenting them for?
I'm a bit worried about the risk that might be run.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I'm nervous. I'm just not sure what the solution is, given that I'm not handing it to them. If I was handing it to them, I guess I could consent them. But
I think I'd ask John. Usually I say, John, what do you do in this situation? What would the medical association say? What would medical defence say? I'd probably have.
Yeah. And that's been our approach to date, as we say, no one knows anything about this, but anecdotally there's a lot of talk. If you're interested in doing it and you can't afford the other options, which are approved, this is what it's called, and we'll help you as much as we can. But it's, buyer beware, it's your own risk, and certainly those devices are pushing these boundaries, because certainly with the FreeStyle Libre we had more than 10% of our clinic using it before it was even available to purchase in New Zealand. So this is just the beginning of a wave of things that consumers and patients will be buying and using and challenging us with. Diabetes is just the tip of the iceberg for this. There'll be people buying their anti-cancer drugs off the internet soon, I'm sure. They'll be going to India to get them. Diabetes is probably the small print in this really challenging, patient-driven. We've been encouraging patients to drive things for a while, though, so I guess we've got to be careful we don't get too upset now that they actually start doing it. Part of me thinks that actually that's sort of a good thing if they're going to challenge us a bit. And if they want to fully partner, though, then they can't take it the other way when it goes wrong. I can't be held liable for their own actions afterwards. Really interesting.